The bullies grabbed him by the neck in the hallway and tried to jump him, 3 against 1. Big mistake. He took all 3 down. Marcus Thompson had always been the type of kid who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 17, he stood barely 5'6", with a lean frame that made him look younger than his years. His dark hair fell across his forehead in waves he never bothered to style, and his clothes always seemed just a size too big, hand-me-downs from his older brother who'd moved away for college. When his family relocated to Riverside High in the middle of junior year, Marcus figured he'd do what he always did: keep his head down, get through the day, and avoid unnecessary attention. Riverside High was one of those sprawling suburban schools with brick facades and long corridors that echoed with the sound of locker doors slamming and sneakers squeaking against polished floors. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual social hierarchies, the gym reeked of sweat and teenage angst, and the hallways served as battlegrounds for daily power struggles. For most students, it was just another school. For Marcus, it was another place to be invisible. But invisibility, he quickly learned, wasn't always an option. It started on his 3rd day. Marcus was navigating the crowded hallway between 2nd and 3rd period when he accidentally bumped into someone coming out of the bathroom. The someone turned out to be Jake Morrison, a 6-foot-tall senior with shoulders like a linebacker and a permanent scowl that suggested he took everything personally. Jake had the kind of presence that made other students step aside without thinking, the kind of guy who'd peaked in high school and knew it. "Watch where you're going, freak," Jake snarled, shoving Marcus hard enough to send him stumbling backward into a row of lockers. The metallic crash echoed through the hallway, and several students turned to watch, their expressions ranging from curious to sympathetic to quietly relieved. It wasn't them. Marcus mumbled an apology and tried to slip away, but Jake wasn't finished. "What's your name, new kid?" "Marcus," he replied quietly, adjusting his backpack straps and avoiding eye contact. "Marcus what?" "Thompson." Jake looked him up and down with obvious disdain. "Well, Marcus Thompson, let me give you some free advice. Stay out of my way." He punctuated the warning with another shove, this one harder than the first, before walking away with his 2 constant companions, Tyler Beck and Connor Walsh. Tyler was Jake's second-in-command, a wiry redhead with freckles and a mean streak that compensated for his smaller stature. He had the kind of laugh that sounded like breaking glass and the habit of finding everyone else's pain hilarious. Connor was the muscle, thick-necked and slow-talking, the type who followed orders without question and threw his weight around because he could. As Marcus picked up the books that had scattered across the floor, he caught glimpses of other students pretending not to notice. A few looked sympathetic, but no one offered to help. That was the unspoken rule at Riverside High. Jake Morrison and his crew were off limits, and getting involved in their business was a quick way to become their next target. Marcus had dealt with bullies before, at his old school and the one before that. His father's job in corporate consulting meant frequent relocations, and Marcus had learned that every school had its predators. He'd also learned that fighting back usually made things worse, especially when you were outnumbered and outweighed. Better to endure it, keep your head down, and hope they'd eventually find someone else to torment. But what Jake and his friends didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High knew, was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just another easy target. For the past 8 years, ever since he was 9 years old, Marcus had been studying mixed martial arts under the tutelage of his uncle Ray, a former Marine who'd competed in underground fighting circuits before settling down to run a small gym. Every summer, every weekend when his father wasn't dragging the family to a new city, Marcus trained. He learned how to read body language, how to control his breathing under pressure, how to turn an opponent's strength against them. But Uncle Ray had drilled one lesson into him above all others. Fighting wasn't about proving you were tough. It was about protecting yourself and others when no other option remained. The strongest person in the room, Ray would say, is the one who doesn't need to prove it. So Marcus stayed quiet when Jake and his friends started their campaign of daily harassment. He didn't react when Tyler accidentally knocked his lunch tray out of his hands in the cafeteria, sending pizza and chocolate milk splashing across the floor while other students laughed and pointed. He bit his tongue when Connor shoulder-checked him in the hallway hard enough to leave bruises. He endured Jake's verbal abuse, the constant stream of insults about his size, his clothes, his family's financial situation, which somehow Jake had discovered and weaponized. The harassment followed a predictable pattern. Mornings were usually safe. Jake and his crew rarely showed up before third period, but lunch was a minefield, and the afternoon hallways were hunting grounds. Marcus learned to take alternate routes, to eat his lunch quickly and leave the cafeteria before they noticed him, to time his bathroom breaks when he knew they'd be in class. For 3 weeks, this strategy worked. Marcus kept his grades up, avoided major confrontations, and told himself he just needed to survive until the end of the school year. Then his family would probably move again anyway, and he could start fresh somewhere else. But Jake Morrison wasn't content with passive intimidation. He wanted a reaction, wanted to see Marcus break, and his frustration at not getting one made him escalate. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October when things took a darker turn. Marcus was walking to his locker after 6th period when Jake appeared seemingly out of nowhere, flanked by Tyler and Connor. The hallway was mostly empty. Most students had already headed home or to after-school activities. "Thompson!" Jake called out, his voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled aggression. "We need to talk." Marcus's stomach clenched, but he kept walking. "I'm just trying to get to my locker, Jake. I'm not bothering anyone." "That's the problem," Tyler chimed in, his voice high and mocking. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Walking around here like you own the place." "I don't think that at all," Marcus replied, reaching his locker and spinning the combination lock with hands that were steadier than he felt. "I'm just trying to mind my own business." "Your business is our business," Connor growled, stepping closer. "Jake's trying to help you fit in here, and you're being ungrateful." Marcus pulled his textbooks from his locker and closed it carefully. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine." That's when Jake snapped. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and spun him around, slamming him against the lockers with enough force to rattle the metal doors. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can just ignore us and we'll go away?" "I'm not ignoring you," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice calm. "I just don't want any trouble." "Well, you've got trouble whether you want it or not," Jake snarled. He grabbed Marcus by the front of his shirt and pulled him close enough that Marcus could smell the energy drink on his breath. "You're going to learn some respect one way or another." That's when Marcus made his mistake. Maybe it was the frustration of weeks of harassment. Maybe it was the way Jake's grip was wrinkling his shirt, but something in his expression shifted. For just a moment, his carefully maintained mask of passivity slipped, and Jake saw something that made his eyes narrow. "What was that look?" Jake demanded. "You want to do something about it, Thompson? You think you can take me?" "I don't want to fight you, Jake," Marcus said quietly. "I just want to go home." But Jake had seen that flicker of something. Defiance, maybe, or just the natural instinct of a trained fighter assessing a threat, and it enraged him. "You do think you can take me," he said, his voice rising. "Boys, I think our friend here needs a lesson in humility." Tyler and Connor moved to flank Marcus, cutting off his escape routes. The hallway suddenly felt much smaller, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows that made everything look more menacing. Marcus's training kicked in automatically, his breathing steadied, his posture shifted slightly to better balance his weight, his eyes catalogued potential weapons and exit strategies. But he didn't move. Not yet. "This is your last chance, Thompson," Jake said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Apologize for disrespecting me, and maybe we'll let you walk away with just a few bruises." Marcus looked at each of them in turn. Jake with his cruel smile, Tyler practically vibrating with anticipation, Connor cracking his knuckles like he was warming up for a workout. He thought about Uncle Ray's lessons, about the difference between fighting and self-defense, about the line between necessary force and unnecessary violence. "I'm sorry you feel disrespected," Marcus said carefully. "That wasn't my intention." "Not good enough," Jake sneered. "Try again, on your knees." That's when Marcus knew the talking was over. Jake wasn't interested in apologies or respect, or even submission. He wanted to hurt someone, and Marcus was convenient. There would be no walking away from this, no matter what he said or did. "I can't do that, Jake," Marcus said quietly. "Can't or won't. Both." Jake's face flushed with anger. "Connor, hold his arms. Tyler, grab his legs. Let's see how tough he is when he can't move." They moved fast, but Marcus had been expecting it. Connor rushed him first, those thick arms reaching out to grab him in a bear hug. Marcus ducked low, letting Connor's momentum carry him overhead, then spun to face Tyler, who was coming in from the side. Tyler was quicker than Connor, but not as strong, and when he lunged for Marcus's legs, Marcus simply stepped aside and let him crash into the lockers. But Jake was the real threat, and he was already moving. He came in high, aiming for Marcus's head with a wild haymaker that had all his weight behind it. Marcus leaned back, letting the punch whistle past his face, then stepped forward into Jake's guard. For a moment, they were close enough to dance, and Marcus could have ended it right there with an elbow to the solar plexus or a knee to the ribs. Instead, he pushed Jake away and back toward the exit. "I don't want to fight you," he said again. "Just leave me alone." "You little freak," Jake roared, his face now bright red with humiliation and rage. "You think you're some kind of ninja? Boys, get him." This time, all three of them came at once. Connor recovered first, his thick arms spread wide to cut off Marcus's retreat. Tyler came in low, still nursing a bruised shoulder from his collision with the lockers, but moving with renewed determination. And Jake charged straight down the middle, his hands reaching for Marcus's throat. Marcus sidestepped Connor's grab, ducked under Tyler's tackle, and caught Jake's wrists as those hands closed around his neck. For a moment, the four of them were locked in a strange, violent dance, each testing the other's strength and balance. Then Jake's grip tightened, and Marcus felt his airway constrict. The bigger boy's thumbs pressed against his windpipe, and Marcus's vision began to blur around the edges. He could hear Tyler laughing somewhere behind him, could feel Connor's hands grabbing at his arms, trying to pin them. This was the moment Uncle Ray had prepared him for. Not the techniques or the conditioning, but the decision. The moment when avoiding a fight became impossible, when self-defense became the only option. Marcus stopped holding back. He brought his hands up inside Jake's arms and struck outward with his palms, breaking the chokehold and sending Jake stumbling backward. Before Jake could recover, Marcus spun and drove his elbow into Connor's solar plexus, doubling the bigger boy over and leaving him gasping for air. Tyler was still behind him, still laughing, still thinking this was some kind of game. Marcus turned to face him, and Tyler's laughter died in his throat. Something had changed in Marcus's posture, in the way he moved, in the expression on his face. This wasn't the quiet, passive kid they'd been tormenting for weeks. This was someone else entirely. "What the hell?" Tyler whispered, taking a step back. Marcus didn't answer. He was done talking. Jake was recovering from the broken chokehold, shaking his head and preparing to charge again. Connor was still bent over, trying to catch his breath. And Tyler was backing away, finally understanding that they'd made a serious mistake. Jake came at him again, this time with more caution but just as much anger. He threw a combination of punches that would have overwhelmed most kids their age, but Marcus moved between them like water, deflecting what he couldn't avoid and avoiding what he couldn't deflect. When Jake overextended on a right cross, Marcus caught his arm and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the lockers. Connor straightened up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "You're dead, Thompson," he shouted, charging forward with his head down like a bull. Marcus waited until the last second, then stepped aside and helped Connor's momentum carry him face first into the wall. The impact was loud enough to echo through the empty hallway, and Connor slumped to the floor, dazed but not seriously hurt. That left Tyler, who was now backing away with his hands raised. "Hey man, this is getting out of hand. Maybe we should just—" "Maybe you should what?" Marcus asked, his voice calm and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Maybe you should apologize. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to jump me 3-on-1. Jake was getting back to his feet, blood trickling from his nose where it had connected with the locker. His eyes were wild with rage and something else, fear maybe, or just the dawning realization that he'd picked the wrong target. "This isn't over, Thompson," he snarled, wiping blood from his face. "You think you're tough because you got lucky. We'll see how tough you are when—" Marcus moved before Jake could finish the threat. 2 quick steps closed the distance between them, and then Marcus's fist connected with Jake's jaw in a perfect right cross that Uncle Ray would have been proud of. Jake's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. The hallway fell silent, except for the sound of Connor groaning as he tried to push himself up from the floor. Tyler stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, staring at his unconscious leader. "Is he dead?" Tyler whispered. "He's fine," Marcus replied, checking Jake's pulse and making sure his airway was clear. "He'll have a headache when he wakes up, but he's fine." Connor finally made it to his feet, swaying slightly but conscious. He looked at Jake's unconscious form, then at Marcus, then back at Jake. "How did you... What are you?" "I'm just a kid who wants to be left alone," Marcus said. "But I'm also a kid who knows how to defend himself when necessary." "You could have done this the whole time," Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could have fought back, but you didn't." Marcus nodded. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I was hoping you'd get bored and move on to someone else." "But we didn't," Connor said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "We kept pushing." "You kept pushing," Marcus agreed. "And when Jake put his hands around my throat, when you both helped him, that became attempted assault. Self-defense law is very clear about what you're allowed to do when someone tries to strangle you." Tyler swallowed hard. "Are you going to report us?" Marcus considered this. Jake was starting to stir, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned. In a few minutes, he'd be awake and probably angrier than ever, but he'd also be aware, as would Tyler and Connor, that the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. "That depends," Marcus said finally, "on whether this happens again." Jake groaned and tried to sit up, one hand pressed to his jaw. When he saw Marcus standing over him, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What happened?" "You got knocked out," Tyler said bluntly, "fair and square." "By him." Jake gestured weakly at Marcus, his voice incredulous. "By me," Marcus confirmed, "after you tried to strangle me while your friends held me down." Jake's face went through several expressions: confusion, anger, embarrassment, and finally something that might have been respect. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, but remaining upright. "I don't understand," he said. You're nobody. You're nothing." "I'm somebody who knows how to fight," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm somebody who chose not to until you forced me to. There's a difference." "You've been holding back this whole time?" "I've been trying to avoid exactly this situation, but when you put your hands around my throat, that choice was taken away from me." Jake touched his jaw gingerly, wincing at the pain. "You could have hurt us really badly." "I could have," Marcus agreed. "I chose not to, just like I chose not to fight back all those other times. But that was my choice, not yours to make for me." The 4 of them stood in the empty hallway, the silence stretching between them like a bridge none of them was sure how to cross. Finally, Connor spoke up. "So what happens now?" Marcus looked at each of them in turn. "Now you leave me alone. You stop harassing me. You stop looking for excuses to start fights, and you find something better to do with your time." "And if we don't?" Jake asked, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Then next time, I won't hold back," Marcus said simply. "Next time, I won't pull my punches or worry about how badly I hurt you. Next time, I'll treat you like the threats you've proven yourselves to be." Jake stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Message received." "Good." Marcus picked up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. I really did just want to be left alone." He started walking toward the exit, then paused and looked back. "And Jake, if I hear about you three picking on anyone else, anyone at all, we're going to have another conversation. And it won't be as pleasant as this one." The next day, word of the fight had spread through Riverside High like wildfire. The details grew more elaborate with each telling. Marcus had knocked out all three of them. Marcus was secretly a black belt. Marcus was connected to the mob. Marcus was an undercover cop. The truth was more mundane, but no less significant. The quiet new kid had stood up for himself and won. Jake, Tyler, and Connor kept their distance, nursing their bruises and their wounded pride. They didn't apologize, but they didn't cause any more trouble either. Other students began to nod at Marcus in the hallways, to include him in conversations, to treat him like he'd earned his place at Riverside High. But the most important change was in Marcus himself. He walked taller, spoke more confidently, and no longer spent his days looking over his shoulder. He'd learned that sometimes, despite your best efforts to avoid conflict, you have to stand up and fight. And when that moment comes, you better be ready. Uncle Ray had been right about one thing. The strongest person in the room was the one who didn't need to prove it. But he'd been wrong about something else. Sometimes, proving it was exactly what you needed to do.